I'm going to argue that hate speech, like racial slurs, ought to be banned by the government. So first, freedom of speech is not an absolute fundamental right. For example, the government should have regulations on speech that incites violence, on yelling fire in a crowded theater for fun, on child pornography, on false advertising, etc. So then the question is, when should government regulate our actions? And one common response is relying on the harm principle. The harm principle says we should be free to do whatever we want so long as we don't harm others' long-term self-interest, where the overall greater good is to have regulations on relevant actions. So for example, I shouldn't be allowed to just go around killing people or stealing things from people's houses or driving while intoxicated, because it increases the probability of me causing harm to others. So then, is hate speech a harm? And I'm going to take a route that isn't well trodden in philosophy, and I'm going to argue that it is a harm in the sense that it can lead to long-term mental health problems like depression and PTSD. For example, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on freedom of speech, it says that it's unknown at the moment as to whether or not hate speech leads to mental health harms. However, when you look at the psychology evidence, there are hundreds of studies demonstrating that it can lead to such mental health harms. For example, in a 2015 study by Paradis et al., it's a meta-analysis study of over 300 studies with a sample size of over 300,000 participants, showing that it is such a causal factor. So now it looks like hate speech is a harm and that it should be regulated by the government. However, it could be the case that the greater good is to actually allow for hate speech, and we should kind of allow for political speech, freedom of speech for political speech, have an open marketplace of ideas where ideas can be freely debated. And this way, even unpopular ideas that might be good, for example, democracy, ideas of democracy at one time in certain places was unpopular. This way, unpopular ideas that might be good might have time to shine, and they might come to fruition. However, the problem with this is that you can get across ideas of bigotry and discrimination without the hate speech. Hate speech is a kind of name-calling, threats to violence that are supererogatory to actually getting across ideas of bigotry. So even if there was a ban on hate speech, that wouldn't diminish the possibility of the marketplace of ideas having ideas in favor of discrimination and bigotry. It's just without the name-calling. So one might object that instead of having a ban on hate speech, we should just allow for more free speech and allow for those who suffer from hate speech to speak up more about it. However, the problem with this is that studies are showing that those who suffer from hate speech generally don't want to speak up due to fear from physical violence. After all, in history, there is a credible link between hate speech and violence. Another objection might be that, well, there might be a slippery slope. If we have bans on hate speech, well, next thing you know, we'll have bans on freedom of the press, and the press can't criticize the government any longer. The problem with this is that this possibility is blocked off with a harm principle. So long as we follow the harm principle, there won't be relevant bans on freedom of the press, and we won't slip down the slope. So with that, I conclude that we should follow most of the Western democratic world and have government bans on hate speech.